bringing attention to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. Hi everyone, this is Andy Steele. Thanks again for listening. And today's interview is with John Remington Graham. He's one of the lawyers who was involved with AE 9/11 Truth's petition to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office for a grand jury investigation of 9/11. We covered this last week on the show. Well, in this interview, he talks about it in a little bit more detail, and he answers some of the questions that I raised last week about the Manhattan D.A.'s office and its jurisdiction. And the discussion goes deeper by discussing justice in general and the fact that the idea of quote-unquote blind justice is really just an ideal but not a reality. This is a fascinating interview you're going to want to hear and share with others, and it's so interesting we went overtime with it, so I'm going to be playing that for you in just a few minutes. First, though, I want to play this clip from Washington Journal on December 4th of this year. The congressman's name here is Duncan Hunter. He's a Republican from California.
William's up first in Athens, Ohio. Democratic caller. Hi, William.
Hi. Congressman, the evidence that the World Trade Center Building 7 was brought down with explosives on 9/11 is real and proven, and more people are waking up to it every day. How much more trust of the American public does Congress have to lose before it faces reality and acknowledges the need for a new investigation into Building 7's destruction?
I don't think it needs any more investigation. I don't think that. I think the way that those towers were brought down were by radical Islamic terrorists, and that's the way it is, and I think every investigation has shown that so far.
Did you read the 9/11 investigation by the committees?
I did not.
But you think it was adequate enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Richard in Lake Placid, Florida.
So that's the guy looking out for you folks somewhere out there in California. Sometimes these clips just speak for themselves and very little commentary is needed. Amazingly there you heard it, the Washington Journal host, Greta Bronner, pushes back slightly and asks the congressman if he actually read any of the 9/11 reports that he's claiming are so hunky-dory, and he says no, he hasn't. Yet he finds them adequate. And here I am, not really knowing what to say. I mean, sometimes an answer is so ridiculous you can't even bother to state the obvious. You just got to shake your head and say, yep. Even more amazing than Duncan Hunter sticking his foot down his throat with this 9/11 answer is the so-called alternative media. You know, the fact that he talked about using tactical nukes on Iran in the same interview was seized on and picked apart by these news sources, but they whistle past the graveyard on this one when it comes to the 9/11 statement. All right, you know, Mox News picked it up, and some sites like the Daily Paul and 9/11 Blogger have the Mox News video on their sites, but for much of the internet, just crickets. Okay, what we're going to do now is what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of our own silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all of the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We're going to do that starting now. And that is 10 seconds. In the following interview, me and James Remington Graham talk about architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth petitioning District Attorney Cyrus Vance's office for a grand jury investigation of 9/11. Now, some of the conversation goes deeper and briefly goes into topics that are outside of 9/11. Of course, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth only focuses on the building destructions in New York and the fact that those buildings were brought down in controlled demolitions, and it takes no official position on other topics. So let me state again, the opinions expressed on the show about topics beyond the scope of that mission by guests and myself are our own and don't always represent the views of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. John Remington Graham was admitted to the bar of the Minnesota Supreme Court in 1967 and to the bar of the United States Supreme Court in 1971. Since then, he's been a public defender in Minnesota, an advisor on questions concerning constitutional law and equitable remedies to the Minnesota State Board of Bar Examiners,
and a professor teaching common law pleading, judicial writs and remedies, American constitutional law, admiralty, copyrights, legal writing, conflict of laws, legal history, and modern civil procedure at Hamline University School of Law, and served as chairman of that school's admissions committee. He was also an occasional lecturer in comparative British, American, Canadian constitutional law and in public international law at Laval University. As well, he was an advisor on British constitutional law and history to the amicus curiae for Quebec before the Supreme Court of Canada in reference on certain questions concerning the secession of Quebec from Canada. Quite an impressive remedy he has. Welcome, John.
Hi. You mentioned one last thing. I don't want to blow up my importance too much, but I was for a number of years the Crow Wing County attorney. I was a chief public prosecutor in the state courts in Minnesota, and I did a lot of grand jury work while I was there.
It's very impressive, and I'm impressed by the fact that you can pronounce amicus curiae. It takes me a few times to practice that.
Amicus curiae.
Curiae. Okay, I'm gonna have to cement that in my brain. But thank you for coming on the show. And like I just went over, you have a very impressive resume that I kind of just glossed through. It's a lot to take in. So before we get talking about 9/11, tell the audience a little more about yourself and your background.
Well, I've been pretty much of a criminal lawyer most of my career, and I have been a specialist as a criminal lawyer in constitutional law and in what we call forensic science and medicine. That's a particular field of the law of evidence where you present technical facts for the judge or the jury to consider in making their decisions. That is scientific evidence, medical evidence to prove certain facts. For example, DNA or other such questions that come up in criminal cases very often.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, and add that to everything that you've done. It makes you perfect for this current situation that we're trying to expose, this reality of 9/11 truth, of what really happened to the Twin Towers and Building 7 with so much scientific evidence. This needs to be in a court of law, and you bring the credentials to the table for presenting it. Now, we always ask this of our guests coming on because it's an interesting to every person that's woken up to 9/11 truth. You always want to know how another person did it. So I want to know, for you, how did you wake up to the 9/11 truth evidence? And added on to that, what do you think is the strongest evidence that really got your attention and made you look at it differently?
Well, for me, I've always been, for a long, long time, I've been interested in forensic science and medicine. That is the presentation of scientific and medical facts to courts of justice. And I've been doing that in connection with a number of questions, like one was water fluoridation, one was the evidence on domestic violence, another is and I'm naturally during the course of my career I was very much interested in the murder of JFK. And so on. And this question comes up. I'm interested in DNA, and I'm interested in acid phosphatase in criminal cases as indicia of facts which either acquit or convict the accused. And as a prosecutor, I was very much interested in this kind of evidence because if you can clear someone with technical evidence and you save the state a lot of money and not having to go forward, if you can convict someone with this kind of evidence, and it's a kind of evidence that doesn't depend on whom or what you want to believe, then that leads to a negotiated disposition, which is in the best interests of both the accused and the state. I had this kind of experience as a public defender in state and federal courts, but I think, and then I had a long period of time where I was going around the country and presenting evidence of this kind in various contexts. When the question of the Twin Towers, I remember one time I was in a church after Mass, and I just brought up, I said, I don't know much about the fall, why the Twin Towers came down, but I've heard that there's some rumbling about, does anybody know anything about this here? And I was at a table with some very bright people. And one guy overreacted, and it was just more than he could handle. This is something where cognitive dissonance kicks in, and you didn't want to believe that. How dare you suggest that our government would not tell us the truth, or that this was an inside job? Are you some kind of a nut, and so on and so. Well, with that reaction, I began to poke around, see what I could find. Eventually, I discovered on the internet something about AE 9/11 Truth, and I, in due course, got to know some of the people in the organization. Eventually, Richard Gage, and I asked questions about whether there had been an attempt to take this matter to a grand jury, because this is the kind of question that should be brought to a grand jury. And I found out to my dismay that no, they hadn't done this, that they'd tried just about everything else. And this is the one thing that really ought to have been attempted right away. So I got in, I started looking at this evidence, and of course was floored to find out what the evidence is. It's an open and shut case. That what happened here was that the buildings did not come down from office fires or aircraft collision, as I had assumed, and everybody else that I talked to had assumed. That indeed it was brought down by controlled demolition, and there are about 9 or 10 facts which play it all out, and it's a yes or no proposition, and I don't understand how it's astonishing that the government got by with lying so long about this, and that eventually somebody woke up to what was going on. And so that's how I got into it, and I've helped AE 9/11 Truth approach Cyrus Vance in New York City to see if we could get a grand jury, and they passed the buck, and they said, well, we don't have jurisdiction over this. Well, of course they have jurisdiction over this. I'm a public prosecutor. I know that a DA in New York County has jurisdiction over murder, arson, manslaughter, and even treason. There's a crime of treason against the state of New York. You can and then of course misprision of felony and treason. So I knew that he was talking through his hat when he was trying to beg off on this thing, and I realized it was obvious that the powers that be in this country didn't want this subject to be investigated in a timely manner. But what I learned in the process in developing the offer of proof that we made for the district attorney in downtown Manhattan was it solidified in my mind the clear fact that these buildings did not come down from aircraft collision or office fires. They came down from controlled demolition, and that you would have had to have had very powerful people with lots of assets that would be able to finance the placing of military-grade explosives and incendiary agents in these 3 buildings to make them come down, and that would have taken at least weeks, probably months, and maybe years to prepare the event.
Right, and for our audience, I want to point you to an article I talked about last week on this show. It says, Manhattan D.A. disclaims authority to prosecute 9/11 murders, and that is the article that talks about this, the topic we're talking about now. And you went over a lot of things. Now, you talked about certain evidence points, and if our audience goes to the article, these letters are linked within the text of the article, so you can look at PDF versions of the correspondence that took place between our guest and Cyrus Vance's office. Cyrus Vance is the Manhattan District Attorney, of course. And now, let's talk about that. Let's go into it a little bit
The evidence
deeper.
itself?
Well, the evidence, what was cited to Cyrus Vance's office as the most critical evidence pointing to controlled demolition?
Well, I'll just read from our offer of proof. How's that? I mean, it's a very
Certainly.
short. The key part of the offer of proof is I'm just trying to bring it up here. Here it is. The key evidence of controlled demolition includes 1, the durability and design of these buildings sufficient to withstand the impact of aircraft and internal fires. 2, extremely high temperatures, 2,800 to 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which are required to melt and actually melted the steel structures and concrete material in the 3 buildings. 3, near free fall acceleration, and 4, symmetry of the collapse of the 3 buildings, including even Building 7, which was not struck by aircraft, yet came down in a manner visibly indistinguishable from a professionally engineered demolition. 6, lateral ejection at a calculated speed of 60 miles per hour of hundreds of steel structural members from the buildings, and 7, mid-air pulverization of an estimated 90,000 tons of concrete during the implosion of the Twin Towers. 8, discovery by public officials in the dust of Ground Zero and across downtown Manhattan of literally tons of previously molten iron-rich microspheres. And 9, discovery in the same dust by an international team of scientists of fragments of unignited nanothermite. Now, these are facts that can be proved up by competent evidence, and they are absolutely inconsistent with the possibility that the reports of NIST and FEMA were on the level. And I have experienced attempts by government agencies before to cover up the facts on an event that had a very traumatic impact on our country. The Warren Commission is a good example concerning the death of Kennedy. In order to disprove any possible conspiracy, they came up with a silver bullet theory, which has been examined many times by experts in ballistics, and we know that it just couldn't be true. And so we know that there was more than one gunman, therefore we know that there was some kind of conspiracy, and then from there, you go on and weigh the circumstantial evidence, and you can pretty well map out what kind of a conspiracy killed Jack Kennedy. Well, we have the same thing here with the Twin Towers and Building 7. The government has attempted to cover up by means of reports coming out of distinguished government agencies, FEMA and NIST, but they are not very clever when you actually get down to looking at the facts. In order to melt the steel, you'd have to have a temperature 2,800 to 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is much, much higher than the kind of temperature that could have been generated by the aircraft collisions that we all have seen. And it's interesting, you know, the fire department of New York City was in the Twin Towers when they came down, and they were in the towers because they knew that there was, given what had happened, that there was no possibility that the buildings were going to collapse, and yet they did. The only way that could have happened was by the planting of military-grade explosives, and it would have had to have been systematically and strategically placed under the supervision of demolition experts over a long period of time. And this is just like DNA. Either Johnny is the father of the child or he isn't, and the DNA, if it excludes him, well, then he isn't the father of the child. And these 7 or 8 or 9 different factors that I've just read off are like DNA. They exclude the possibility of office fires or aircraft collision being sufficient to bring those buildings down.
Right, and I want to read a quick excerpt from the correspondence that's linked to the article at ae911truth.org. It says, in this connection, we wish to stress that we are not claiming that 9/11 was caused by any particular faction, domestic or foreign, whether operating within the public or private sector. We are saying that the destruction of the 3 buildings was professionally and expertly engineered by those who did not have the best interests of our country at heart, that the truth must be revealed and known, and that, if possible, those responsible for the wrongs committed on 9/11 should not be protected but ought to be brought to justice in an orderly, civilized manner, including the protections of due process of law. Now, we've talked about this aspect of our mission before many times on this show, the audience will know. But I want to hear it from you. Why did you feel it was important to stress that we're not pointing a finger at any particular party?
Well, because, there are various, you've heard undoubtedly finger pointing, and we're not interested in that. We want to first establish that there was that the buildings came down from controlled demolition. This is like with Jack Kennedy's case. There was more than one gunman. There was a conspiracy. Okay, once you start with that, then you can start systematically probing the facts in an impartial way. A good public or special prosecutor will know. It had to be somebody who had access to the buildings and who had the means of hiring the kinds of experts that had to place the explosives. And you start out by calling in witnesses in the buildings, the companies, from the companies that had access to the buildings and management and were in charge of security. You bring them in and you question them one at a time, and you just follow where the evidence leads. If you start out with a preconception, like, for example, it was the Israel lobby, or that it was the powers of high finance on Wall Street, or if it was the Saudi government or whoever, if you start out with some preconception, that will distort your systematic examination of the truth. So you have to eliminate all of these possible suspects from your mind and just take the evidence one step at a time and take it where it leads you. And my experience with grand juries, and I've had a lot of it, is that the people on grand juries are usually very good citizens, and they have to be followed, have to be led very carefully, but they generally do a good job. And my impression is that they can do a better job than a government investigating agency. They can do a better job than the FBI. When I was in Minnesota, they certainly did better on a number of cases than, say, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehensions, which was a state version of the FBI in Minnesota. The grand jury is the best way to go about it if it is properly led, and assuming that you have people on the grand jury who are responsible people, as almost always occurs. And I don't want to start out with pointing the fingers at anyone, having a political motive, because that will cause a travesty and will prevent us from coming to a clear understanding of what the facts actually are. It has to be a very carefully directed investigation.
Now, when I listen to you speaking, I think back to high school, to those logic proofs that we have to do in math class. And at the time when you're young, you're thinking, why the heck do I got to do this? What is this all about? Why do I ever have to use this? Well, because what you're describing is the word version of logic proofs. When you start off, if not A, then B, then C, then this. Because
That's right.
This is teaching you how to think logically, which a lot of people don't do. And of course, when you mention the scientific evidence that Building 7 was not which was not hit by an airplane. This building was brought down in a controlled demolition. When you just mentioned the scientific evidence, people's minds, and people in official capacities, congressmen, investigators, like with the FBI and such, they will immediately jump into a defensive position. They want to defend their government. You haven't even mentioned anything about the government doing it. You're mentioning the evidence, and they'll say, "Oh, that's a terrible thing to say. The planes brought them down," and overlooking the fact that Building 7 was hit by an airplane.
You say, well, okay, let's take a look at the facts that would have to happen in order for the planes to bring them down. I mean, how do you bring down 3 buildings with 2 planes? And how is it that Building 7 came down just like the Twin Towers, and yet it wasn't hit by a plane?
Right, it fell in 6.5 seconds, and it doesn't make any sense. No steel frame high-rise has ever done that before or after 9/11.
Yeah. It's as I say, it's like DNA. I mean, either Johnny is the daddy or he isn't, and if the DNA excludes Johnny, that's it. You don't have to worry anymore. But the problem that we have is what is called cognitive dissonance in psychology. It's you're bringing upon someone a belief or a conclusion that they just don't want to accept because it involves too much trauma. It was like the time that I was defending farmers in the Middle West during the 1980s, during an agricultural mortgage foreclosure crisis. And these farmers would say, "But this is America. This can't be. This couldn't be happening. Judges couldn't be this corrupt. They couldn't be in bed with the bank lawyers. This foreclosure crisis could not have been generated by manipulation of the market of money and credit and agricultural commodities. This couldn't happen, except that, yes, that is what happened, and you have to just look at the facts one at a time in order to come to this conclusion." Well, there couldn't have been a conspiracy with JFK. I mean, we all know that there was a single bullet that caused a back wound and came out the throat of JFK and hit Connally. Well, take a look at the bullet. If that had happened, it would not be pristine. It would be distorted. It would be fragmented, and yet this is a pristine bullet. And the throat wound was an entry wound, as observed by the doctors in Dallas. And eventually what you do is you box these people in to the point where they have no choice but to say, well, this isn't what I want to believe, but this is what I must believe. It's the same thing with 9/11. It's a fighting cognitive dissonance with technical facts that do not depend on whom or what you want to believe. Like, how much would it take? How much heat would it take to melt these steel beams so that the buildings would collapse? And how much heat could have been generated by these planes colliding with the buildings? Well, they might have been able to generate, say, 700 or 800 degrees Fahrenheit, but you need 2,800 to 4,000 in order to melt the steel. So you know that couldn't have been the cause for the collapse of the building. And this, you have to. These are yes or no type considerations. Once you've gotten people, you finally overcome their cognitive dissonance with technical particulars that they can't deny because they're too black and white. Then you can start saying, okay, now who did it? And the way you do that in this particular case is to bring in people who had access to the buildings and were in charge of management and so forth, and bring them in one at a time. And then if they want to take the Fifth Amendment, you can give them an immunity for their testimony, and then they can't assert the Fifth Amendment anymore, and then they have to tell the truth. And eventually they see that it's to their best interest just to tell the truth. They're not going to be held guilty for it. And then you get information, go a step at a time until you reach the top. And this is a pretty good method of investigation. and I think it would work. And so what we did was to go to Cyrus Vance. We worked behind the scenes. We said, Mr. Vance, you show us. We'll have a meeting here. You lay down the perimeters of the meeting. You tell us what conditions must be met so as to assure discreet handling by your office. And by the way, I know what it's like to be under pressure, under political pressure, to undertake prosecutions, and it's one of the difficult parts of being a public prosecutor, especially a chief public prosecutor. But that's why we were completely behind the scenes. We had no press fanfare. We said, Mr. Vance, you tell us what precautions should be taken, and we will respect those. And he just backed off and said, well, I don't have any jurisdiction over this. Well, of course he had jurisdiction. This is murder, manslaughter, arson, treason. These are all within the jurisdiction of a criminal prosecutor for the state of New York. I mean, and they were talking through their hat, and we knew it, and they knew it. But all we have done now is to take and publish the correspondence, such as we have it, so that individuals can read what we did, what we said, what evidence we laid down. We even included in our evidence a video presentation showing the witnesses and allowing them to talk, and so that they would see the witnesses on the screen, understand their credentials and their backgrounds, and these are very, very respectable witnesses, very powerful witnesses, and outline the elements of the proof for them. They knew that we had something, but no one is surprised. I mean, no one necessarily is surprised. And this gets into the next point. We knew in advance that they were going to try to prevent, or probably going to try to prevent, an investigation. It was like anybody with any sophistication at all knows that the Warren Commission, including Alan Douglas, who was a former director of CIA fired by JFK, we knew that they were going to try to disprove a conspiracy. But it's still important to make the attempt. And why? Because you have to make an historical record. Why is an historical record important? Because, as Lord Acton, a famous British historian, said, historic responsibility has to make up for want of legal responsibility. And it may be that we cannot find out in our time who the culprits were that financed the implementation of the placing of the dynamite, not dynamite, but the military-grade explosives and incendiary agents. It's not dynamite. It's much more powerful than that. These explosive and incendiary agents, and it would have been these people will probably never be brought to justice under temporal law, and it will have to be left to God. But future generations are going to look back, and they will be able to put this thing together if we lay now a good historical record for them to discover.
Now, I got a question for you. For our audience who hasn't read any of the correspondence yet, Cyrus Vance's office said, we don't have any jurisdiction. Now, is that really all they said? Did they give any kind of qualifying words?
They said that it belonged to the federal government.
Where does that line get drawn? Because I'm confused when it comes to terrorism, and of course I'm not a lawyer, so that's why I'm asking you.
Mm-hmm.
Because terrorism, it doesn't involve another state in most cases. It involves a certain faction of people, and so you get into a kind of gray line. So if somebody goes and blows up a pizza joint in the name of
crime
their cause,
against the state.
That's a crime against the state. So they have the jurisdiction to investigate that, even if it is against the federal government to try to.
You might have a murder in interstate commerce that would fall within the power of the county of the U.S. District Attorney. Even so, most of those crimes are prosecuted by state prosecutors. Murder, manslaughter, and arson are all crimes that state prosecutors prosecute all the time, and very seldom do federal prosecutors become involved.
When do they? I mean, where is that line? Where does a state legitimately lift its hands up and say, this is completely out of my jurisdiction, to which point you would agree with it?
Well, this is not the point. I mean, if it involves murder, manslaughter, or arson or treason, it falls within state jurisdiction, and that would normally be where you would prosecute it. John Brown, for example, was prosecuted for treason against the state of Virginia. You can have treason against the state of Virginia, or the state of Minnesota, or the state of New York, just as much as you can have treason against the United States. And it may be that both can prosecute, but the state certainly has authority. And take a look at the Boston Marathon case. Was it last the 15th of April last? State prosecutors are prosecuting the Tsarnaev, Mr. Tsarnaev. They're prosecuting him just as much as federal prosecutors. And there's no question that Mr. Vance's office has jurisdiction to prosecute this. And this is particularly important, the state prosecutor to it because everyone, the federal government has almost a conflict of interest because part of proving the crime will be disproving the reports of NIST and FEMA, which are obviously phony because they leave out consideration of all pertinent and available evidence on key points.
Now, last week I spoke about a story, I guess it was a year or a couple of years old, about a gentleman who was supposedly plotting to blow up synagogues in New York, and he was prosecuted under New York State's anti-terrorism laws that were passed after 9/11. Now, I want you to comment on this because I commented on it, but I'm just speculating. I don't know the law very well, but just under this law, forgetting all the other things you cited.
You probably couldn't have prosecuted under that if they were passed after 9/11. It would be an ex post facto law if it were prosecuted. But before 9/11, New York had laws that would cover cases of this kind. Laws on murder, manslaughter, arson. And most states have laws on terrorism. Minnesota had when I was prosecuting, we had a statute on terroristic threats. We prosecuted under that all the time. It was very common, so there was no problem. The state of New York could have prosecuted.
That's what I thought, that under that specific law that it might not apply simply because 9/11 happened before, but there are so many avenues with which to go after this and investigate it and prosecute it that I find it hard to believe that Cyrus Vance's office, if they really wanted to, couldn't find a creative way.
The only reason they're not is that they don't want to. And that they don't want to because this is politically too hot to touch.
Now, by wrongly citing, as you're saying, that they have no jurisdiction, is there any kind of, other than ethical and moral crimes being committed, is there any kind of dereliction or duty or crimes taking place?
Well, when I was a prosecutor, it was claimed that I was derelict in my duty in prosecuting cases of criminal sexual conduct. And when I was prosecuting child abuse and sexual abuse of children or adults were hot button items, and people get very, very excited about that. Because my office was prosecuting 2/3 more of this kind of crime than my predecessor was, who was considered some kind of an expert in this field. And we were prosecuting a lot more. I had to be much more careful about reviewing the evidence. And there were times when individuals who were clearly innocent were being railroaded. And I remember one case where a man was being prosecuted for raping a child, I think 3 years old. And the key evidence was bruises on the insides of the thighs of this little girl. And I had three groups had this examined by. There were three doctors of medicine: a pathologist, a pediatrician, and a general practitioner, all of whom examined the evidence. All of whom came to the conclusion that the bruises on the thighs of the little girl were caused by horseback riding. Now, I cleared that man, and I dropped charges, but the pressure on my office was horrendous. Mr. Vance had this problem with Dominic Strauss-Kahn. You know, I mean, it was a hot button item, and he examined the facts, and he knew that Mr. Strauss-Kahn was not guilty, and therefore he dropped the charges. Well, there are also the kind of pressure that you have. I understand why we're not trying to push junk science on this guy. We laid out the evidence and we gave him a video and we said, now here, study this stuff and what can we do, and we'll bring in experts who will confer with you, and they're including witnesses from the fire department in New York City and so on. That will satisfy you the legitimacy of this thing. But of course, they didn't want to get involved because they knew that if they did, it would be too hot to touch. This is whoever was behind this thing has enormous power. They have enough power to orchestrate a news media covered up. Remember the morning of 9/11? There was a kind of how the news media, all the major news media in the country, were marching in lockstep. This is Osama bin Laden, and the 19 suicidal fanatics and Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth. We never heard. There was no mention of the way that these buildings came down, which was immediately suspicious. Somebody who had this had to have control of the press. They have to have enough power to make it known to the state prosecutor that he better not touch this, otherwise his career is going to be in trouble. These are enormously, and you have to think about the power that you'd have to have in order to have access to these three buildings and be able to finance and direct the planting of military-grade explosive and incendiary agents strategically throughout these buildings. Think of the enormous amount of power that you'd have to have. What we're doing here is simply laying down an historical record, because sometime after I'm through, I'm now 73, and I'm not going to be in the saddle much longer. But eventually there's going to be another generation, a new generation coming up, but we will have established an historical record. And once from these historical footprints, as it were, this historical record, they will be able to deduce who it was and come to a pretty good conclusion. It's just like now, 50 years after the death of Kennedy, we can say a lot more about who the culprits were behind his murder than we could at the time, because we've had, first, time has passed, more evidence has come into place. We've also been able to take a dispassionate look that the passing of time permits. And I think that this is going to happen. I have no doubt that who was really behind the murder of Kennedy? I'm quite sure that Jerry Corsi's book puts he's right. I think in the same way, we're going to be able to deduce who was the murderer, who were the culprits that planted the explosives in these buildings and made them come down the way they did. And eventually it will not, as time passes on, the cognitive dissonance passes away. If you're looking at, for example, Lincoln's murder, it no longer is important to you. You are no longer have an emotional block against accepting the reality that Edwin Stanton orchestrated that murder. Edwin Stanton was the Secretary of Defense. At the time, the cognitive dissonant effect of accepting the reality that Stanton was the leader, one of the leaders of the conspiracy, was just too much for you to handle emotionally. But I can look at it 150 years after Lincoln's death and see that the facts much more clearly. I can look at Kennedy's death much more clearly now and objectively now than I could at the time. I remember I was alive at the time. I was in law school at the time. And the same thing is true with 9/11. Historical responsibility will compensate for lack of legal responsibility. And I have no doubt that as long as we do our part in our time of laying down a proper historical record, people will see in the next generation, after I'm dead and gone, they'll be able to look back and see, oh, certainly this was controlled demolition, and they will be able, by taking a look at the circumstantial evidence, to deduce who it was.
Now, when I think of justice, I think of that statue with the woman holding the scale, and there's a blindfold covering her eyes because justice is supposed to be blind, and that means that regardless of whatever the personal opinions are of the prosecutor, in a perfect world, you want to think that if the evidence shows something, that they will go with it, that they will prosecute it, investigate it. This is with the case with 9/11. But what I'm hearing from you, and the impression I would get if I was coming from another planet or something, and just as a passionate or a disconnected observer, would be that really it depends on not only just on the whims of the prosecutor, but on whoever is behind them, that justice isn't blind, that when something's big...
Blind justice is an ideal. But, I've talked to a lot of young lawyers. They spend all this time and money to get through law school and get admitted to the bar, and then they come to the reality that judges are corrupt and that cases are fixed and on and on and on, and this is a very hard thing for them to accept. Lawyers are oftentimes the last ones. They're willing to believe this because they put so much of themselves into becoming lawyers and learning to love the abstract beauty of the law. Well, get into the real world, and we find out otherwise. No, the system is not straight. But let's take, for example, the Dred Scott case. You probably know something about that case. That was decided in 1857 by the United States Supreme Court. And at the time, a lot of people suspected that this case had been fixed. Well, not long ago, the Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote a book on the Supreme Court, and he laid out a lot of evidence in that book that shows precisely that the Dred Scott case was fixed by influence peddling of some very powerful politicians of that day that interacted with the judges, and they came up with a corrupt judgment. And, of course, the corrupt judgment was one of the explosive, incendiary items that provoked civil war. And this stuff happens. We have to understand. When I was teaching, I had an idea that wasn't very well received, but I still think it was what should happen. We should teach a course on judicial corruption and how it happens. There are a lot of cases and a lot of material that you can look. You can go back and look at the Dred Scott case today, and you can see exactly how the case was set up and how the judges were fixed and how the political influence was brought to bear. And, of course, a lot of your suspicions based on circumstantial evidence is now confirmed with the revelations of Chief Justice William Rehnquist in his book on the Supreme Court. And we can look at this, but at the time, if you were living at the time, the impact of cognitive dissonance would be very great, because lawyers don't want to believe that their system is corrupt, or at least many of them don't, and most of us don't. But with the passing of time, much of the emotional impact of cognitive dissonance passes away. And I have no doubt that whereas Mr. Vance is obviously terrified at the possibility of having to cooperate in getting up a grand jury investigation of 9/11, I have no doubt that in a future generation, after Mr. Vance is retired and maybe dead, we'll be able to look back on this and when the emotional stakes are gone and be able to figure this thing out. The nice thing about what Lord Acton said, historic responsibility must make up for lack of legal responsibility, is that actually historical responsibility does make up for lack of legal responsibility. But it is our task in our time to lay down the historical foundations. And so what I was doing in working with Richard Gage and others in your organization was to help set up an historic record. And the reason why AE 9/11 Truth is so important is that they have done such a splendid job in creating an historical record, and a much more complete historical record that could be laid down, say, for Jack Kennedy's death or even Lincoln's death before that.
Yes, and in our last few minutes, because I want to know, I've talked so many times on this show about how this is a situation where many of us are kind of writing the rules as we go along, because we've never quite faced a situation like this before. Now, I understand that there's been events that have happened where, like the Kennedy assassination you've talked about before, where people kind of woke up in a slow way, but with 9/11 and the advent of the internet and people communicating with each other, it's almost like
much faster, much more efficient.
It's like walking into a room and finding your spouse in bed with another guy, and the lights just suddenly turn on, and now you're standing there wondering how to react in that split second. What do you do? Do you start punching the dude out, or do you turn around and walk out and get in the car? I mean, we're figuring this out as we go. And so, has there ever been a historical precedence of success, not just in terms of a moral victory later on in generations as they look back and say, oh yeah, you're right, those people were right back then, but I mean where people were able to overcome cognitive dissonance on such a massive scale like this? Do you know of any kind of historical precedent like that?
Well, yes, it's happening right now. Think of the recent attempt of Obama to get us into war in Syria. Now, who would ever think that Obama was supposed to be the peace candidate would try to ram the country into war in Syria over on flimsiest possible grounds. The moment where the history from, say, the Bay of Tonkin resolution, the Bay of Tonkin incident up to this moment has been a building event that would have ordinarily taken a couple of 100 years to reach the point where the people of the country would finally rise up and force the president to submit this question to Congress in conformity with the original intent of our Constitution. And then even after that, and it became clear that Congress wasn't going to go along with this, he said, well, I'm going to do it anyway, and then he was outplayed by Vladimir Putin. This is an example of of the kind of thing that you're talking about, with vast increase in communications, make history move faster and enables people to react to things like this much more quickly. We had an historical record for Lincoln's death, which is kind of spotty, and then we get up to Kennedy, we have a much better historical record. Now, with respect to 9/11, we have a very, very good record, and people will eventually wake up. And I have no doubt that because of the revolution in communications and that we now have, and that we will eventually find out, and we're going to learn something from it, just like we learned how to stand up to our president and stop him from dragging us into a war in Syria, which LBJ was able to do in the Bay of Tonkin. Now, LBJ, the President of the United States, can no longer do that because people are so much more quickly advised of the facts and are able to rise up. So I think that you're going to see something like this. I think we're going to find out in due course. This is a whodunit, but I think we're going to find out much sooner. I think we will know in less than 50 years, certainly. Maybe 25 years we will know, where it took 50 years for us to figure out what happened to Kennedy, and it has taken us 150 years to have a better insight as to what happened when Lincoln was murdered.
Now, I completely agree with you, and I say this all the time. Regardless of how people feel about how quick our success is going to come, we are preventing future incidents like 9/11 from happening simply by talking about it and letting the other side know that we're onto it, that we're watching them, and they got to be scared and know that that they can't pull this stuff anymore. John Remington Graham, thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening. Remember, you can hear this program every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download the shows at 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.